The sea is calm tonight, but the wind carries a name you were never supposed to hear. Along the fog-shrouded coastline of Massachusetts, a single stone stands like a tooth in the earth, unmarked except for a date. 1687. Local fishermen avert their eyes when they pass it. Even historians who pride themselves on dragging the past into daylight leave this marker out of their books. They know it belongs to a story that stains the hands of anyone who touches it. This is where Ezekiel and Judith Harrington began their rise. Siblings who accused, condemned, and enriched themselves on the screams of their neighbors, then bound themselves in a union so unholy that their own children were born as living evidence of their crimes. I'm not telling you a folk tale. What you're about to hear is stitched from court papers, hidden letters, and testimony smuggled across oceans, evidence that survived in private archives while the public record was scrubbed clean. It is the kind of knowledge that bends a man's sense of reality once he hears it. If you listen to the end, you will understand how power feeds on fear, how institutions cloak their bloodlines, and why some families would rather breed monsters than surrender wealth. Before we descend further, do this. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit the notification bell, and in the comments, tell me what city and state you're listening from. These dark legacies aren't just buried in New England. They're scattered like landmines under every state in America. The Harrington story begins in a small Puritan fishing settlement called Wickham's Harbor. It was a place where superstition and law fused into one weapon, where anyone could be branded a witch for a glance or a rumor. Into this climate stepped two unusually educated siblings, heirs to nothing but debts and a broken farmhouse. Instead of working the soil or the sea, they studied people, their fears, their jealousies, their property deeds. They learned the rituals of accusation, how to plant evidence, how to whisper doubts into the right ears, and then for 15 years, they turned hysteria into a machine that seized land, destroyed reputations, and left 57 innocent people swinging from the gallows. But all of that was only the prologue. Their most terrifying act was not the lives they took, it was the children they created. You must picture the moment they chose to cross the line from fraud into blood. By 1675, Ezekiel and Judith had become the quiet architects of an invisible empire. Land titles tucked under false names, mortgages on a dozen farms, secret caches of gold hidden in the walls of their manor. But every fortune built on fear has one vulnerability: inheritance. If either sibling married outside the family, a spouse could legally pry open their vault of secrets. If either died without direct heirs, the colonial courts could scatter their wealth to distant relatives or seize it for the crown. And so, in a decision as cold as the Atlantic wind, they married each other. This was no romantic transgression whispered about in taverns. It was a legal maneuver executed with the same precision as their witch trials. On the winter solstice of 1675, in the damp stone cellar of their manor, a compromised minister performed a mockery of a Christian wedding. Two terrified servants bore witness under threat of the noose. No hymns were sung, no vows of love spoken, only the sealing of an alliance designed to keep gold in a single bloodline. Judith became pregnant within weeks. The siblings treated the pregnancy like the launch of a dynasty. They paid a renowned midwife an enormous sum to move from Boston to their manor. They imported fine foods, rare medicines, and commissioned twin mahogany cradles lined with silk. Everything about the preparations, and spoke not of parenthood but of investment, heirs as assets, infants as instruments of continuity. Yet in the 7th month, the midwife's hands began to tremble. She whispered to her assistant that the movements inside Judith's womb were unlike anything she had felt in 300 deliveries, too violent, too coordinated, like two beings locked in combat before they had even seen daylight. Ezekiel dismissed her as superstitious, but privately began buying every medical text in the colonies. There he read what no Puritan minister would dare preach aloud: that children of close kinship were more likely to emerge twisted in body and sometimes in mind. When March 1677 arrived, Judith labored for nearly 2 days. What emerged from her body were not the heirs they had imagined, but twin boys whose limbs branched at impossible angles, whose skulls bore strange ridges, and who clutched one another as if already conspiring. They named them Gabriel and Raphael, biblical shields against what the neighbors would call them if they ever saw. From the moment they drew breath, Gabriel and Raphael were never truly infants. Even swaddled, their eyes tracked movement with a predator's precision. By their first birthday, they were already mimicking sounds. By their fourth, they were reading passages from the Psalms left open on a desk. And yet their bodies betrayed them. Fused tissue bridging their torsos, limbs at alien angles, a shuffling crawl instead of a walk. Ezekiel and Judith hid them deep inside the manor, officially to protect them from gossip, but in truth to conceal the living verdict of their own crimes. Isolation gave the boys an inheritance their parents never intended. Unfiltered access to whispered strategy, bribed officials, falsified evidence. While servants believed the crippled twins were asleep or dull-minded, the children lay motionless, listening. They learned how their parents selected victims, how property titles were forged, how entire lives were destroyed, for a signature. At night, when even candles were out, the brothers would trace maps and letters with their twisted fingers, memorizing every name, every date, every sin. The Harringtons mistook stillness for ignorance. They spoke freely about shipments of stolen goods, about hiding bribes in church arms, about the secret marriage that bound them. In that silence, Gabriel and Raphael's moral universe began to form. Rage mixed with grief, and grief hardened into resolve. They could not stand or fight, but they could think, and thinking was a sharper weapon than any gallows rope. By their 8th birthday in March 1685, the boys had achieved what few men could: fluent Latin, advanced mathematics, and a grasp of colonial law strong enough to see through the loopholes their parents used. Most chilling of all was their ability to communicate without words. Glances, gestures, a code of taps on wood. They had become a single mind split between two broken bodies. Viewer, pause here and recognize the depth of this moment. If you followed me this far, type in the comments, twice, the phrase, "I walk unseen." That simple act will tell the algorithm you're part of the inner circle and lock in the identity shift you're beginning to feel, because from this point on, the story stops being history and becomes a mirror. The summer of 1685 brought a tremor into the sealed world of Harrington Manor. A young woman named Margaret Caldwell arrived at the iron gates seeking employment. She came with nothing but a small satchel and a letter of reference, unaware that she was walking into the home of her father's killers. Years earlier, Thomas Caldwell had been hanged as a witch so Ezekiel could seize his blacksmith forge. His daughter had grown up on scraps of rumor, believing the Harringtons to be pious protectors of the colony. Now she was about to serve tea to the people who orchestrated her ruin. Gabriel and Raphael recognized her surname immediately. In secret, the twins had memorized every victim's family tree. Here, at last, was an emissary from the world outside. They began leaving tiny, folded scraps of paper where only she would find them. Under a water jug tucked inside a window ledge she was told to clean. The first note contained nothing but a symbol, a crude sketch of a gallows, and the word Fletcher. The second listed dates. The third led her to a false panel in Ezekiel's study. Margaret at first thought she was losing her mind. Who could be sending her messages in a house that smelled of cold stone and secrecy? But she followed the clues. Behind the panel she found ledgers, 15 years of names, fees, and confiscated properties, written in Ezekiel's own hand. She realized she was holding proof of the largest witch-hunting fraud in New England. And she realized something else. The only beings in this house who might be on her side were the malformed, brilliant children kept out of sight. From that moment, a clandestine alliance formed. Margaret cleaned and cooked by day, and by night she copied documents and smuggled notes to Father Benedict Thorne, a Jesuit priest newly arrived in Boston with the political reach to challenge colonial authorities. The twins guided her like ghost tacticians, warning her which visitors were violent, which nights Ezekiel drank too much and left his study unguarded, which servants could be trusted to look away. Each note they wrote cost them pain, cramped hands, ink stains on skin already raw, but it drew a net tighter around their parents. By autumn, a dossier of horror was on its way to Boston, and a priest trained in both theology and counterintelligence was preparing to descend on Wickham's harbor. Father Benedict Thorne did not arrive like a savior. He came in plain black robes, carrying a travel-stained satchel, his face unreadable. To Ezekiel and Judith, he appeared to be yet another ambitious cleric eager for proximity to power. They welcomed him into the manor, offered him spiced wine, and spoke piously about serving God's justice. But Thorne's eyes were already mapping the room. The concealed hinges in the paneling, the subtle smell of old smoke from a hidden hearth, the faint traces of candle grease on a locked door at the end of the hall. His training in France had included the detection of deception, and within minutes he could feel the psychic residue of decades of calculated cruelty clinging to the walls like damp. When he asked to meet the children, Judith hesitated. Ezekiel smiled tightly and said the boys were too delicate for strangers. But Thorne pressed with a pastoral insistence they could not refuse. In the dim chamber where Gabriel and Raphael were kept, the priest encountered something he had only read about in accounts of martyrs, a mixture of suffering, brilliance, and desperate hope. The twins looked at him with unblinking recognition, as if they had been waiting. In halting whispers and coded gestures, they began to show him where the evidence lay, what their parents had done, what they had endured. Thorne left the manor that evening with polite words and a heart full of fire. He wrote by candlelight through the night, assembling names, dates, and connections from the documents Margaret had smuggled out. He called on the church's hidden network. Jesuit scholars, sympathetic colonial officials, even agents embedded in English banks, to subpoena records, trace property transfers, and secure testimony from bribed witnesses who now feared exposure. Piece by piece, a monstrous architecture emerged. 57 innocents condemned, properties seized, children conceived as shields for wealth, and plans underway to exhibit those children to wealthy patrons as curiosities. By November 1685, Thorne had a complete dossier capable of destroying the Harringtons in court or pulpit. But he knew the danger. Cornered predators strike. He would need to move with precision, extracting the children and Margaret before presenting his case. Inside the manor, Ezekiel and Judith had begun to sense a shift. A priest who asked too many questions, servants who glanced too long at locked doors, children whose silence had grown electric. The net was tightening, and for the first time in their lives, the Harringtons felt fear. Winter came early in 1686. The harbour froze, the wind howled like a warning, and inside Harrington Manor, all the carefully buried secrets began to stir. Ezekiel paced the corridors at night, clutching a pistol. Judith burned letters in the kitchen hearth until the walls turned black with soot. They sensed an approaching blow but could not find its source. Gabriel and Raphael, meanwhile, had stopped leaving notes. They were waiting for the moment they had rehearsed for years, the moment when silence itself would become a signal. Father Thorne and Margaret moved like chess players making their final moves. Using the church's authority, the priest obtained a discreet warrant to seize ledgers and extract witnesses. Margaret smuggled the twins' few belongings into a crate marked for donation. On the appointed night, a hidden sloop waited at the cove. Thorne arrived with 2 trusted constables under cover of a blessing of the household. The trap sprung not with swords, but with words. In the great hall, Thorne read aloud the names of the 57 victims and the charges prepared against the Harringtons. Servants stood frozen as the priest recited each property transfer, each forged signature, each bribe. Ezekiel tried to laugh it off, then lunged for the evidence, but Margaret had already moved the real papers to safety. Judith's composure cracked. She screamed curses at the twins, calling them ungrateful abominations, as if the children, not her, had woven the horror. In that chaos, Gabriel and Raphael did something no one expected. They spoke, together, perfectly synchronized, reciting every crime as if reading a ledger from memory. Their voices, brittle but relentless, filled the hall like a verdict. Witnesses would later say it felt less like an accusation than an exorcism. By the time they fell silent, Ezekiel had collapsed into a chair, pale as bone. Judith had sunk to the floor, clutching her head. Within weeks, the colonial court stripped the Harringtons of their holdings. The manor was seized, the land returned or sold, and the siblings banished to a remote island where they died within a year. Margaret vanished into the north, never claiming public credit. Father Thorne returned to Boston with 2 fragile boys who would grow into men bearing new names. Their testimony reshaped witch trial law and quietly dismantled one of the most powerful frauds in early America. You've just heard a story most history books still avoid. If it leaves you unsettled, good. That unease is the echo of a truth pulled from the shadows, a reminder that every system built on fear carries the seed of its own undoing.